Head of the Capital Markets and Financial Institutions Division Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Very happy to be here. For inviting me, but also the two associations for inviting OECD to join the summit. I have some slides. Maybe if yes, you can put up, then I can continue with the slides. So here is the first one. I will talk about a bit, introduce you to the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. Maybe you are familiar, but I will give some, let's say, background information. Then our work on corporate sustainability, sustainable bonds. And a bit the last point is the AGM shareholder meetings. We are conducting a current work stream on this area. When I, let's say, prepared, I thought about some kind of an introduction to explain you why maybe sustainability is also relevant from CST's perspective, etc. But then I listened to Mr. Perry's presentation this morning, it was on the top in terms of the highlights, that these are the main trend, ESG and passive investment. So maybe I don't really need to convince you that this is very relevant for your work, I guess. But from our perspective, why this change is happening? There were like 9-10 mega trends, and most of them overlap. But one thing that was maybe missing, that we think is also very important, why the sustainability discussion or the role of shareholders discussion is important in the CST context, is the shareholder empowerment. Basically, of course, we are discussing about stakeholder democracy, engaging with stakeholders. But if you really look at the last 20 years, what we have seen is shareholders have become very important in corporate decision-making processes. For example, before the 2008 crisis, in a very few countries, we had say on pay, those shareholders having roles on executive remuneration. Now it is almost in every country. 10 years ago, in a few countries, only shareholders actually had a say on related party transactions. Now in many countries, indirectly, directly, shareholders have a strong power. So shareholders have more power, they are empowered, they are more part of the corporate decision-making process. The second trend, of course, is digitalization. You have been discussing a lot digitalization. It makes possible many things that were not possible in the past. And maybe like a third trend we may think from the expectations of the society, of the politicians, of broader investor community about sustainability. There are huge expectations that corporations should play an important role in addressing sustainability concerns, either on the social side, on the environmental side. But of course, this means that entire capital market ecosystem should be involved and should help address society's core challenges. And in terms of the principles, these were originally developed in 1999 by the OECD Corporate Governance Principles. And then in 2015, actually in Turkey, in Antalya, when Turkey was hosting the G20 presidency, they were endorsed by G20 leaders. So since 2015, they are G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. They are corporate governance principles, but they are not directly addressed to the companies. They're addressed to the regulators, to the authorities, to the ministries who are responsible for basically regulating corporate governance, a public policy instrument. Currently, they are adhered or endorsed by all OECD and G20 countries, basically more than 90% of the global market capitalization. And they have 6 areas, 6 main chapters. One is the institutional framework, including CST's legal framework for good corporate governance. And the second one is the rights of shareholders, basic rights, but also it is improving. We have made recent changes on digitalization, role of institutional investors, disclosure, both sustainability disclosure, but financial statements as well, board responsibilities, and a new chapter which was included last year on sustainability. And I will talk about that chapter a bit, but first, why are we, from an OECD is a public policy institution. Our main role is we develop standards, we collect data, we do country assessments, country reviews. So why OECD is interested in corporate governance discussion? There are 3 main objectives why we are interested in this discussion. Also, these are the core objectives of the principles. First is good corporate governance is necessary to promote access to finance from capital markets. Again, from a public policy perspective, we believe capital market financing is good for productivity, for innovation. We have done many studies showing the links between market-based financing and productivity and innovation. We also believe from a financial stability perspective, market-based financing is good. It reduces the risks in the system in general. Again, there were IMF studies, BIS studies, but also our own studies on this point. Second, good corporate governance is important to protect investors. Now, this is a very core element, and is also a bit the social part of it again. Today, there are almost, so the total market capitalization is around $120 trillion, and 43% of that is held by institutional investors directly. And that almost that 43%, half of it, 20% is pension funds. So today, almost 600 million pensioners, pension income depends on the performance of the companies that are listed on the stock exchange. So it's so important to protect that investors, but of course the broader investor community. And the rest, the third objective is of course the sustainability. So we believe that a risk-based approach for sustainability, that companies are sustainable, but they are also resilient, will also contribute to the broader sustainability of the economy. And in terms of the sustainability chapter, what have been the discussion has been the same everywhere. Like it's a global discussion. So within the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, it was almost like an 18 months of discussion. All OECD G20 countries, European Union, US, China, India, maybe, OECD has 38 members, and some of the G20 countries, for example, India, Brazil, China, they are not members of the OECD. But since the corporate governance principles are endorsed by G20 leaders, they are members with same voting rights of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee. So all G20 countries join this work. What they agreed at the end, they agreed to include a new chapter on sustainability, which discusses the materiality, basically what should be disclosed to public, how the concept of materiality, this dichotomy between double materiality and single materiality. We don't go there, but we believe that already, the materiality, traditional materiality concept is interpreted in a broader way, that covers also the impact on society, on environment, and on stakeholder. And we have some new definitions there. The principles encourage the use of international standards, especially, the current international development of sustainability standards. They also encourage the availability of reliable metrics to actually follow if companies are meeting their targets. Now, they have goals or targets, different companies, but they need to have some metrics. We need to have some metrics so that we can actually see if they are following their targets. And then external assurance, this is a very important part of it. The information is there, companies make the disclosure, but it needs to be audited by someone. It is not mandatory in most places now, but we advise, and this was the agreement, there will be like a phase-in process for over the mid-long term, a bit of a close to mandatory assurance of sustainability information. And then the other part is related to the board responsibility. So what is the role of boards, company boards, in sustainability as part of risk management process as well? And the third one is the dialogue between shareholders and stakeholders. These were the new changes in the principles. And based on this, what we do, again, principles is the standard, which basically we update every 10 years as good practice guidelines. But then now we have a new product, which we call it OECD Global Corporate Sustainability Report. Basically, it tracks company-level practices. So we look at 50,000 listed companies everywhere in the world. Whatever data we can get, we collect them, we put them in a data set, and we issue this report. We issued the first one this March. It was based on 22 data. We are now preparing the new one, hopefully with the 24 data. So next year, you will see the more recent trends. And what it shows in many dimensions what actually companies are disclosing to the public. Again, 50,000 listed companies in the world. And based on our assessment, so almost 9,600 companies, so 10,000 almost, they have sustainability information, like good quality sustainability information they produce and disclose to public. In terms of numbers, it is, let's say, 20%. No, it's not a big number of listed companies, but since they are the very large companies, in terms of market cap, they really represent a big part of the market, almost 80% of the market, and this is only ongoing. No, the trend is increasing. And then one very key metric here is the scope, the carbon emissions. Of course, mostly carbon emission, like the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, basically what companies produce and they use through energy is disclosed almost like, again, 80–90%. But the problem is on the scope 3, which is your supply chain carbon emissions. It's a difficult one, and it's very few companies actually disclose. Of course, there are, for example, interesting. On the first one, if you look at, it's not mandatory in the US to disclose sustainability information, but almost all large companies do it anyway, like 95% of the market cap. So our main message here is not like, okay, shall we disclose? Should it be disclosed? It's already happening, and the numbers are increasing every day. It's more like how to do it, how to best quality provide this data, how to make sure that they are audited. And then one other element in that discussion is the assurance review. So of course they like give the information to public, and some of them are difficult information, like carbon emission data. I don't understand anything, so someone needs to check this information. And there is also a trend that they are actually audited by third parties. You see on the right, globally, almost 40% of that auditors are the auditors of financial statements, like big audit firms. In 60% of the cases, they are third parties, like other consultancy firms. They audit the sustainability information. Of course, there is nothing wrong that audit firms are auditing the sustainability information, but there might be some potential conflicts of interest. In particular, if shareholders are the ones choosing the auditor or approving, but the executives are the ones choosing the sustainability auditor, there can be some kind of potential conflict of interest. And investor landscape, this is a really important, I think, work, and also thanks to really the ownership data from maybe CSDs. So when we look at it, who are the owners of 100 largest emitters in the world? But these are listed companies. And you look at them, 40% of their shareholders is owned by institutional investors. So basically, institutional investors have almost 40% voting power in high carbon emitting companies. And very importantly, almost 18% is state-owned also. So if you put the state-owned institutional investors, it's like almost 60% of the 100 high emitters in the world, like carbon emitters in the world, are owned. You can have let's say 60% of the majority of the voting rights. It depends. It's different in different countries, but this is basically the main trend. So, okay, what are the messages? Again, the report is available. It's a very detailed report. We will hopefully do it every year. We're looking at 40,000 companies around the world, what actually they disclose. So one thing is sustainability-related disclosure frameworks are, again, improving fast, but we believe that it needs to be really flexible. Currently, very large companies have the capacity to do it, but many smaller companies don't have the capacity to do it fully, and it may even discourage them to come to the public market, which we don't want to happen. So there needs to be some flexibility in sustainability reporting. Assurance reviews are very important. Many large companies already do it, but it is not mandatory, and again, maybe, especially for large companies, it should be probably the trend for mandatory assurance review of sustainability reports. And in terms of maybe the last point on the institutional investors, since they are the largest owners, 40% of owners of high emitting companies, then their role, their stewardship, how they are encouraged to actually involve in voting in these companies is very key. And the second item I have is on the sustainable bonds, which is a very important new product in one way, and now they became a bit like a key tool, at least one of the useful tools for climate project financing, basically. And we had two categories. One is the GSS bonds, basically the bonds you finance and you use the money for sustainable projects. But there is also this new trend of sustainability-linked bonds. The proceeds are not directly linked to a project, but what you do is you have some, like a metric, some targets. If you don't match, you are punished. So that will be these are also two trends. When we look at the numbers, it increased a lot, 4 or 5 times over the last 5 years. So big numbers, relatively, $400 billion US dollars sustained by financial and non-financial companies. Most of them are green bonds. You see 21 was the peak, and then it went down a bit. But 21 was the peak for all corporate bond issuances. So it was the big thing, like, COVID crisis. This is really good also in terms of market-based financing. It was COVID hit, bank financing was limited. Many companies went to the corporate bond. It was a huge increase. We saw the same thing in the sustainable. So it is stabilizing now, let's say around $400 or $500 billion issuance now. So it's an important part of the issuance number, but still around 10% of total corporate bond issuances. And who issues sustainable bonds? If you look at the main trend of Europe is the main one, even if US is globally half of the corporate bond market, also, but in terms of sustainable bonds, US is like less, almost 10%, but Europe issues half of the sustainable bonds. And our work, so we have issued, again, this global debt report we issue every year. There's a special chapter on sustainable bonds. What we show there, one key issue, it's a very controversial issue. Every day there is an article about this. We look at companies issuing sustainable bonds, so compare that information with normal bonds, but we also did it with governments. So governments, normal bonds and sustainable bonds. basically there is no yield difference in any country, almost any context. There's no meaningful yield difference between sustainable and non-sustainable. Some people say this shows some kind of a weakness because issuing sustainable is more expensive. Also, we believe that there's huge demand. There is not even enough issuances. So there needs to be a bit of a lower yield, at least a few basis points, but we don't see it. And some others say that, no, it's not bad because they have become a mainstream. Of course, I mean, if you grow, the yields should converge. So what we see. But basically, there's no yield difference. And the discussions are still ongoing. One really very challenging thing, we also look at some 100 prospectuses around the world, look at sustainable bond prospectuses, and how basically most of them allow refinancing even of the closed projects. So many of them do not actually generate new capital for green finance. This is allowed in many prospectuses. And if you don't do it, if you don't actually meet your targets, there is no penalty almost. So it is a bit of a, there is a lot to be done. It's a great market in one way, a good product, but there is a lot to be done. There's a big scope to improve their governance and contribution. And the last point in my presentation is the new study we are conducting now, also with the participation of MKK from Turkey and 5 other countries. We are looking at the annual shareholder meetings. I said at the beginning, it's so important now. Shareholders play a very big role. So it's so important that AGMs function well. They actually serve the purpose as a good corporate governance, but also allows investors, owners, shareholders to participate in corporate decision-making processes. So what we do, we call them peer reviews. So we look at all countries, basically, what are the basic rules, frameworks, structures, and we do 5 case studies and plus all countries. And one of the case studies is Turkey, so we are very grateful for the cooperation. The report will be, looks at there are 5 areas. So the legal framework for remote hybrid meeting participation, identification of shareholders, transparency before, after the meeting, chairing of meetings, and safeguard for digital security. So these are the areas we are looking at 48 countries, and we are doing 5, let's say, specific case studies. And what are the preliminary findings? The report will be released early next year. It's not finalized yet. But one thing is that still, hybrid meetings are not legally, regulatory allowed in several countries. I think in Turkey it was 2012, no? It's a very long time ago we had the hybrid model, but in many countries still legally it is not possible. There are a lot of changes happening there. The record date is, because we sometimes believe, there are practical difficulties also actually for shareholders to vote, especially cross-border voting, etc. And one of them is the record date. And there is no standard here. Many countries have very long record days. A few countries only have 1 day. Indonesia and Turkey, I think maybe one reason is they use the same EGM system. It may help it make it very strong, because this is very important. No? The delay makes it very difficult for shareholder participation. And there is, and then the blocking of the shares, which makes it even more difficult. Electronic online voting, we look at practices, how it is implemented. In almost all countries now, it is facilitated, but still the legal framework or regulatory framework is not set yet. Voting, vote counting process. There is some parts of it is that was left, many parts. I will also, for example, who should chair the annual AGM, how to vote count, how to report after, before. There are not really widespread frameworks at the national level in many countries. Maybe it was fine, it was best practices, companies knew how to do it. You don't have to codify them. But, recently also with the climate activism, the AGMs become a bit more important and also more controversial in some cases. So maybe there is a need to codify some of these best practices in regulatory legal environment. In many countries, we see that these are not really, not really decided. And on terms of the same a bit on the Q&A, so especially online meetings, when to ask Q&A, how to respond to Q&A, do you have to respond to all questions? If not, some countries, they separate the meetings, one meeting the day before for Q&As, one meeting for other things. But which one is the best practice? So we are also discussing this. And then the shareholders really want to see the minutes of the meeting. So that is one part of the study. We are looking at 48 countries, how these practices are. And to conclude, so basically the corporate governance principles, we just revised with the sustainability chapter. So we are very happy to work with anyone to promote their implementation. We have The Corporate Governance Committee is OECD G20 members, but we have the Latin America, Asia, other roundtables, MENA roundtable of corporate governance. So we work with many regulators and authorities, and of course CSDs are more than welcome to join. In terms of the sustainability disclosure, sustainability, corporate sustainability, we believe the flexibility is core here, because we shouldn't really push maybe smaller companies. Again, we don't want to make public markets like a difficult place for companies to come. So there needs to be some balance. In terms of the sustainable bonds, it's a great product, but there is a lot of scope, we believe, to improve their functioning, prospectuses, disclosure. It may not be exactly what investors think they are as of today. And maybe on the last point, the AGMP review, we are concluding it currently. Early next year, it will be available. We will be happy to circulate, because I think that's very relevant to you. You will see all 48 countries, how actually all these things are regulated, or maybe not regulated, but voluntarily targeted. Thank you very much for the invitation again. I was very happy to be here.